November 1942. Hitler and members of his general staff are traveling to Munich aboard his personal train.
In the early years of the war, Hitler commanded his troops and held his staff conferences on his special train that would then, roll from place to place on the battlefront, kind of a mobile headquarters.
And normally, when he would stop at the sidings and see people, he would go to the window and he'd wave and he'd show himself.
Of course, he loved the public relation. He loved being with people. So he was really like a public man, yeah?
But as his train pulls into a station, Hitler is faced with a grim sight.
He looks over and he sees a train, basically a cattle cars, full of soldiers who've come from the Eastern Front. They're bedraggled, their uniforms are filthy, some of them are injured.
They see their Fuhrer, the man they've risked their lives for, the man they've devoted their service to. And clearly, this is the time for Hitler to say a few inspiring words to these badly wounded warriors.
But instead of greeting them in any way, he just looks at them disdainfully, turns around and has his servant close the blinds so he doesn't have to see them.
As if he simply wants to read them out of his universe. And that, to me, says a lot about this increasingly isolated Hitler. So his mood was about as bad as it could get. And given the fact that we're talking about Adolf Hitler, that's something.
Three months later, in Russia, at the Battle of Stalingrad, the Germans suffer their greatest defeat since the start of the Second World War. 91,000 soldiers surrender. More than 250,000 are dead. Hitler's dream of conquering the East hangs in the balance.
Hitler always assumed that the war, particularly against the Soviet Union, was going to be a knockout blow, it would be over in a few months, and that he would be able to carry on as the victor and everything would be wonderful.
Hitler had hoped in 1942 to smash his way into South Russia, collapse the Soviet Union, take the oil fields, and go right through the Caucasus. It was a war-winning strategy, Hitler believed. Now it had failed disastrously.
As the Third Reich faces collapse, Hitler needs a victory at all costs.
He desperately needs a success. He desperately needs to stop the Red Army, and he desperately needs to regain the initiative.
This is Hitler's last throw of the dice, so it's a massive moment.
February 1943, Berlin. Following the defeat at Stalingrad, the Nazi PR machine kicks into action. The man in charge of keeping the morale of the German people high is Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels.
Goebbels was a propaganda genius, and in a way, he was the brains behind the Third Reich. He was the one who translated Hitler's message out to the general public.
Big success of the Goebbels propaganda that so many believed that if something goes wrong, it wasn't Hitler's fault, it was traitors, it was bad generals, or it was the weather. But with Hitler, we cannot lose this war. It's not possible.
Realizing the defeat at Stalingrad could have a severe impact on the German people, on the 18th of February 1943, Goebbels delivers the most famous speech of his career. Standing in front of 14,000 carefully chosen audience members, Hitler's propaganda mastermind calls upon the nation to prepare.
And now he's saying it's time to get serious and wage total war, to rededicate ourselves. It means every man, woman, and child dedicated to fighting the war, to doing whatever you could do within your role of age or gender or ability. It was impressing upon the entire people the gravity of the situation. And that, to me, is what total war is about.
if the German people rally behind the Third Reich, they will be successful. And it started a period of new deprivation. So theaters were closed, films were closed, certain restaurants were closed, and other activities that were seen to be frivolous and not for the aid of the state or for the war effort, all of a sudden were shut down.
As Goebbels rallies the masses, behind the scenes, their Führer is descending into a state of turmoil.
Hitler's state of mind after Stalingrad is much worse than before. He all of a sudden has suffered his first huge, great blow in the war.
So he's really nervous. He is really ashamed and embarrassed and doesn't really know how the course of the war will go on.
As Hitler's nerves fray, his ability to lead is called into question.
Amongst the generals in the high command, there were several people who no longer believed that he was the greatest warlord of all time. Hitler had stopped listening to generals and instead believed that he was ultimately right about everything, which was a disaster for a commander-in-chief.
I think the record is fairly clear that they all felt that, at least by 1943, Hitler's decisions were no longer professional, that they were defective.
He started rambling at the Führer conferences, sometimes would go on for 15, 20 minutes, really almost without a point. And so he was not the man that he was earlier in the war.
One man beginning to doubt Hitler's capabilities is commander of the SS and the chief architect behind the Nazi concentration camp system, Heinrich Himmler.
At the start of the war, Himmler was known as Der True Heinrich, faithful Heinrich, and this was because of his abject loyalty to Hitler.
But after the fall of Stalingrad, Himmler's faith in Hitler is starting to waver. If Hitler is to reclaim his title as the greatest warlord and restore his power in the East, he desperately needs a win against the Red Army. In March 1943, a golden opportunity presents itself. After a successful German counterattack at the city of Kharkov in southwest Russia, a bulge has been formed in the Soviet front line. Stretching approximately 150 miles from north to south, at its center is the city of Kursk. Amassed around the Kursk salient are 5 large Soviet armies, containing more than 1 million enemy soldiers.
The plan is to deliver a decisive blow to the Russian army that is assembling large troop concentrations in this Kursk salient.
And if the Germans can cut them all off, well, it'll show the world that Germany's not finished.
But to secure a victory, the German invasion of the Kursk salient needs to be quick. Hitler chooses the mastermind behind the Blitzkrieg, or lightning war technique, to lead the offensive, Erich von Manstein.
Von Manstein was a classic aristocratic Prussian officer. Manstein's whole family, on both sides of his family, had been soldiers, so he had the military ethos in his bones.
Of course, Hitler, petty bourgeois origins, had worked himself up by the scruff of his neck. He'd been a homeless vagabond in 1912 before joining the German army and making something of himself and eventually entering politics.
In terms of personality, Manstein and Hitler could not be more different. Erich von Manstein was somebody who kept his emotions strictly under control. And Manstein also had a certain degree of snobbish disdain for Hitler, based entirely on social grounds.
But they see that they need each other at some point, because we must show that Germany could win this war, and we are invincible after all.
As Hitler and Manstein plan for the Battle of Kursk, in Moscow, Hitler's nemesis, Joseph Stalin, is feeling victorious after winning the Battle of Stalingrad. his first major win since the outbreak of war. The battle may be won, but the war in the east is far from over. With large parts of southwest Russia still under German occupation, Stalin is determined to take back what was once his. But to achieve any hope of success, he must confront his military's fatal weaknesses.
During the earlier stages of war, Russia was underprepared. They didn't have enough troops or equipment. They weren't prepared for mobilization, and this ultimately resulted in their defeat. Stalin knows that he needs to rearm. In terms of military equipment, he was intent on outproducing Germany.
And that was to be the decisive thing about World War II. Stalin said, this is going to be a battle of machines. It's going to be the person who produces the most machines is going to win.
By April 1943, Hitler's plan for the Battle of Kursk is underway. Codenamed Operation Citadel, Hitler intends to launch a pincer movement in the north and south and trap the enemy.
The aim of Operation Citadel was really to capture the great Russian armies and to reinvigorate the whole war effort in the east.
Much like Stalin, who needs to ramp up his armament production, at the heart of Hitler's decisive offensive in the east are what he calls his wonder weapons, or Wunderwaffe.
Hitler believes that he has an ace up his sleeve in the operation against Kursk, and the ace are these brand new models of tanks.
Leading the charge is the formidable Tiger I, the crown jewel of German tanks.
The Tiger tank has gone down in history as being the best tank that was ever invented. Invincible, powerful, the symbol of the battlefield. But in early 1943, the Tiger tank was pretty much untested. It had seen limited action in North Africa and at Leningrad, but not very much at all. Kursk was going to be the big test.
Weighing up to 60 tons and with armor 100 millimeters thick, the Tiger tank has an 88 millimeter gun in the turret and can destroy an enemy tank from over a mile away.
It can not only blast through any tank, it can blast the turret off of any tank. So these are extremely powerful weapon systems.
Also being rolled into production is a tank so new, it's never seen action, the Panther. Hitler's goal, to flood the battlefield with a killing machine that is bigger, faster, and has better precision than the Red Army's infamous, yet dated, T-34.
And frankly, the T-34 might have been the greatest tank of the war in 1941 and 1942, but it's beginning to show its age, as any designed weapon system does over time. The Germans have designed the Panther partially as an answer to the T-34.
During the build-up to Operation Citadel, Hitler's involvement in the production of these weapons intensifies.
Hitler was obsessed with the development of these Wunderwaffe, these wonder weapons, attending meetings and laying out details that he wanted to be adhered to, such as the thickness of the front and the side armor, the size of the gun, the speed the vehicle would move at.
He was so convinced that these new tanks would give the German army the edge for this offensive that he really considered these new tanks like decisive.
A month later, in May 1943, on the battlefields around Kursk, the Germans are awaiting orders on the imminent attack against Stalin's Red Army, when Hitler suddenly gets cold feet.
Hitler wanted to delay the Citadel attack.
Hitler himself had been extremely nervous about it.
The whole concept of Operation Citadel made his stomach churn, and one can understand why.
Hitler has received reports of an unexpected and preemptive strike by the Soviet Air Force on German-occupied airfields near Kursk. 500 Luftwaffe planes have been destroyed. What's more, there's bad news about Hitler's wonder weapons.
The Panther wasn't really combat ready. He hadn't been tested properly, and so the crews hadn't been trained properly, and they weren't yet used to fight on a battalion level.
Meanwhile, the Tiger is proving slow to produce.
He wanted the Tiger tank ready, and only 12 were being produced per week.
So Hitler thought, we can't do this because we don't have the equipment ready. We need more time to assemble the troops, to finish training, to finish maintenance.
So all in all, he put it off and put it off and put it off.
Hitler's hesitancy puts pressure on his already fraught relationship with his chief commander, Erich von Manstein, who with each week that passes grows increasingly anxious about pulling off a successful attack.
Manstein wishes to go early, Hitler wishes to go later. This is one of the most tension-fraught moments within the Wehrmacht's high command.
To many, Hitler's indecision is another sign that he's far from the supreme commander that he once was.
And it tells a lot about Hitler's state of mind. After all these failures and after all these defeats in early 1943, he really was afraid of making another decisive error.
And he was even more jittery and nervous before Kursk. You know, he understood that this was like a terrible risk he was taking, but an essential risk.
Six weeks later, on the morning of the 5th of July, Hitler's soldiers are still dug in on the front line around Kursk. Suddenly, the earth beneath their feet begins to shudder, and the sky is set ablaze.
Just when they thought they were coming in with this massive offensive, boom, hell erupts around them.
A bombardment of Soviet artillery and mortar rains down on thousands of German troops.
And this is where the artillery is the god of war. This cacophony, deafening sound, and I can only imagine what that was like from the German point of view, to be on the receiving end of that.
Shocked German units scramble to respond. Hitler's wonder weapons that he's been desperately waiting for are now ready and have recently reached the front line. But the Germans pay a high price for Hitler's delay. Somehow, the Red Army have received word of the enemy's initial assault.
There's a lot of speculation as to how the Soviets knew that the Germans were going to attack. Some think that perhaps they captured somebody who told them. Perhaps there was a deserter. There are all sorts of stories. But nevertheless, the Soviets were pre-warned and were expecting the German attack.
The German attack is based on the classic blitzkrieg operation. The only drawback is that it misses one key element of blitzkrieg, which was, of course, surprise. The Russians knew it was coming.
The Germans retaliate by unleashing more shells than they used in the France and Poland campaigns combined.
The German artillery responded by an even more massive strike with an amount of ammunition never used before. It must have given them the thought of, we will now really start a battle where we will crush the Soviets.
Leading the German assault on Kursk from the north is General Walter Model, nicknamed Hitler's fireman thanks to his ability to rescue bad situations on the battlefield.
Model's a really tough character. He's absolutely hard-nosed towards himself, towards fellow officers, and towards the troops under his command. You know, Hitler once turned to an associate and was talking about Model and said, Model, he'll get the job done, but I wouldn't want to serve under him.
Model's directive is for his 9th Army in the north to smash through the Soviet front line and advance 50 miles towards Kursk as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, in the south, under Manstein, the 4th Panzer Army will close in on Kursk, covering a distance of 65 miles. The Germans planned to reach Kursk in no more than 10 days.
At some point, these two pincers will meet in the middle, perhaps on the high ground east of Kursk, and pinch off all Soviet forces in the salient.
On the first day of the battle, with support from the Luftwaffe and artillery, Modell's troops in the north achieve initial success, managing to knock out 42 Soviet tanks, losing only 2 of their own. Despite their early gains, the Germans in both the north and the south soon face a big problem. The most formidable defenses of World War II. Tank traps, barbed wire snares, over 500,000 mines, and more than 3,000 miles of trenches.
By the time the Germans attacked Kursk, it was the strongest fortress in the world. To have been a German soldier on that first day would have been absolutely terrifying. The Russians would put 10 guns together and fire at single vehicles coming towards them. It was absolute carnage.
The Soviets have upped their game. No army in the world dug itself in deeper. It's going to be tough going everywhere.
The Germans assumed, because the attack had been put off for so long, that the Russians would have pretty advanced defenses, but they had no idea that it was going to be quite as impressive as it was.
The biggest loss the Germans are experiencing in the north is a loss of time, momentum, initiative. They've hit a brick wall.
To pull together a defense of this land was not easy. There would have been thousands of engineers who walked over the battlefield step by step, marked the location of various kinds of fire points and defensive points and trench communication systems before the digging began.
German generals such as Model are convinced that it must have been more than Hitler's delay that helped the Red Army build such precise defenses.
It's an astonishing achievement. How did they know?
3 months earlier, and 2,000 miles away from the battlefields of Kursk, in a Victorian mansion house in the English countryside, the nation's brightest minds are decrypting secret messages of the Nazi war machine.
Bletchley Park was full of code breakers, mathematicians, and scientists, all working very, very hard to try and decrypt the Nazi codes. So, for example, when they were about to invade North Africa, they knew when and where the attacks were going to take place. So this was hugely important.
But as the code breakers of Bletchley Park work around the clock to feed intelligence to the Western Allies, one of their colleagues, a quiet, Cambridge-educated Scotsman named John Cairncross, is secretly gathering intelligence for a very different purpose.
John Cairncross was one of the Cambridge Five, one of the famous spies who worked for the Soviet Union before, during, and even after World War II. The British, of course, consider them to be traitors, but they were often motivated by what they believed to be, helping the Soviet Union against fascism and convince themselves that they were doing the right thing.
And they were feeding really top-level information from the very top of the British Foreign Office and other parts of the British establishment, including Bletchley Park, to Stalin.
After joining Bletchley Park a year earlier, Cairncross has discovered a way to smuggle out papers containing decrypted German military information left behind by his colleagues.
And instead of picking these up and destroying them, which you would have thought they would do, they just left them lying around on the floor, and then they were just cleaned up for the next day. And John Cairncross went around and picked them up and stuffed them in his trousers. And then when he had his leave, he went to London and he met his Soviet Secret Service agent and gave over this information to him.
From there, Cairncross's treasure trove of Nazi secrets is quickly passed on to Stalin in Moscow.
Stalin was so paranoid that he didn't always trust the information that he was getting from the Allies. However, they did, of course, trust the information that they got from John Cairncross, who was their man at Bletchley Park.
The stolen papers reveal a wealth of information about the German plans for Kursk, including crucial details about the Luftwaffe.
He was able to locate the aerodromes behind the German lines so that they knew where the Luftwaffe were coming from.
This information is what allowed the Soviets to carry out their preemptive strike on German airfields at the start of May, during which 500 planes were destroyed. But that's not all.
They got specifications about the Tiger tank, which meant that the Soviets could produce shells that could attack the Tiger tank. They got specific positions of where the Germans were going to go with their tanks and their armies and so on. So the Soviets more or less knew where the battle was going to take place.
Nowhere is this intelligence more apparent than on the battlefields of Ponyri, a village with a key railway station just 45 miles north of Kursk. Despite facing vast defenses, Model is convinced that if his 9th Army can break through at Ponyri, Kursk will be theirs for the taking.
As Model's forces grind their way forward very, very slowly at 12 miles in a week, the focus of the battle is the road that leads down to Kursk. I mean, that's the main artery in which Model is operating. And this obscure little place in the Soviet Union becomes the focus of Model's drive to the south and also Soviet determination to keep the Germans from Kursk.
Railway lines are always very important, and the Ponyri station was a very crucial point, and the Soviets had especially well prepared in this area.
On the 6th of July, the Germans and the Red Army go head-to-head in what becomes one of the bloodiest battles on the Eastern Front.
I mean, here at Ponyri is the sort of cutting edge, the red-hot fulcrum of the struggle. You've got to fight to the death. And when you told Russian soldiers that, they did.
German Private Walter Wolf, who fought at Kursk, recalls an equally ominous order sent down from the German High Command.
Our orders were no prisoners taken and save the last bullet for yourself. You will not go in a prisoner war camp. You will not be taken prisoner if you can avoid it. The Russians had the same. They didn't take any prisoners. Well, I mean, when you're a soldier, you do what you're paid to do and what you're ordered to do.
The war in the East is of a different type than the war in the West. It is existential. Everybody realizes that it is war to the death. The numbers of casualties go way up. It's a truly much more vicious kind of warfare.
Making its debut at Kursk is another one of Hitler's wonder weapons, the Ferdinand tank destroyer, named after its designer, the famous automotive entrepreneur, Dr. Ferdinand Porsche.
The Ferdinand was turretless, but it had a huge 88mm gun, which had a range of about 1.5 miles for destroying enemy tanks.
But the Ferdinand has a fatal design flaw, making it wholly unsuited for the close combat fighting that befalls the Battle of Ponyri.
The Ferdinand has an awesome gun, but it doesn't have a machine gun. That means Soviet infantry in the vicinity are a real threat, to this, this vehicle.
During the northern assault on Kursk for Model's 9th Army, this lack of secondary armament was a real problem because when the enemy closed in on it, it had no means of defending itself.
Of the 90 Ferdinands sent to Kursk, only half escape annihilation. Also failing to live up to expectations is the Panther.
The Panther suffered teething problems. Many of the Panthers were damaged in Soviet minefields. Others were knocked out by Soviet anti-tank guns from the sides. Others had suffered mechanical breakdowns. And after just a couple of days, there were just a handful of Panthers left. So the Panther was more like a disappointment to the crews.
By the 11th of July, after 5 days of savage fighting, thousands of soldiers from both sides lie dead in the fields around Pont-Iri. For Model, with more than 10,000 of his men either killed or wounded, and over 200 tanks destroyed, it's clear that Hitler's fireman has come up against a fire even he can't put out.
Model's drive from the north has come to a halt. They're not driving any further, and they're coming nowhere near Kursk. And that, of course, unhinges the entire operational conception.
As Operation Citadel falls apart, so too does Hitler.
Having been so confident of victory and of his new weapons, when he heard the news of the defeat in the north, Hitler must have felt dejected and broken and disappointed.
He can't understand what's happening. He starts to get very worried and starts to turn in on himself. Not only does he start to change psychologically, but he also starts to physically deteriorate. And one starts to see hints of things that hadn't existed before.
He had got a shake in his hand. He wasn't concentrating as long as he was able to.
He's weaker, he's more sallow, he's not as quick on his feet. And he starts to isolate himself, both from the high command and from the people of Germany and the soldiers that represent him.
As a result of his physical and mental state, Hitler comes under the constant medical care of his most trusted physician, Dr. Theodor Morell.
Dr. Morell had a big appetite with a big belly to go with it, and was described by others as being quite a grotesque individual. He was overweight, overbearing, had bad breath, he sweated profusely, and his office was like a pigsty.
After successfully treating Hitler for stomach cramps in 1936, Hitler hired Morell to be his full-time personal physician, a position he maintains for the next 9 years.
Hitler was a chronic hypochondriac, and he claimed to have all sorts of ailments, from bad eyesight, which he claimed was a result of a gas attack in the First World War, chronic stomach pains, diarrhea, gas, and eczema. In the early years, Dr. Morell prescribed a healthy regime for Hitler, giving him vitamins and glucose in an attempt to keep his health as good as it could be.
But Morell's treatments soon take a strange turn.
Morell had Hitler taking all sorts of pills. One of them had an ingredient of rat poison or strychnine to help with his gastric problems, and another contained a gun cleaner. He also started to give Hitler a series of injections, some of them containing bull semen, and this was to help his virility and his libido. These bizarre treatments give us a great insight into both doctor and patient, the doctor verging on quackery, and the Führer's willingness to try these remedies.
By 1943, as the tide of war turns against Hitler, his mental and physical well-being begins to spiral.
Hitler became more and more erratic. His moods were very low. It was clear that he was falling apart.
At the height of Hitler's drug consumption, Morell is administering up to 28 different medications a day, including cocaine, earning him the nickname the Reichmaster of injections. As Hitler's drug addiction grows, the northern assault on Kursk has spluttered to an all-out standstill. Any hope of victory now rests solely on Manstein's units in the south.
On the southern face of the salient, the Germans made better progress. Whereas there's a 10-mile advance in the north, it's 3 times that in the south.
Leading the advance on the south is Commander Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, spearheaded by the infamous Death's Head Division.
So this is Hitler's elite. And anytime the Waffen-SS is on a sector of the battlefield, one thing you can be sure of, these will be full-strength German divisions. And that's hardly true for anywhere else on the Eastern Front by 1943.
By the 11th of July, Hoth and Manstein's units are just 50 miles from Kursk and are amassing around the sleepy village of Prokhorovka. Meanwhile, racing in to defend the area are Stalin's mechanized units, led by Commander Pavel Rotmistrov of the 5th Guards Tank Army.
Prokhorovka, though it was a small town, it was a very major town, because if you capture Prokhorovka, all roads to Kursk are open. And for the commanders of the Red Army, it was also clear you have to defend Prokhorovka at any cost.
At 6:30 in the morning on the 12th of July, the first tanks start rolling towards each other.
There's a thick fog on the battlefield. There is quite literally German columns heading east and Soviet columns heading west, tank columns on the same road.
As the fog clears, a brutal battle of steel on steel begins. Over the next 24 hours, more than 1,000 armored vehicles and anti-tank guns become embroiled in one of the largest tank battles in history.
Prokhorovka is the climax of the entire panzer tank era in the 20th century. It's the sort of mechanized equivalent of hand-to-hand conflict. Tanks driving right into each other. A battlefield of twisted metal and burning flesh, unlike anything that had ever happened in human history.
As ground forces are supported by aerial combat in the skies above, charging across the fields through the smoke and carnage are Hitler's much vaunted Tiger tanks.
At Prokhorovka, there were very few Tiger tanks, but what they lacked in numbers, they made up for with strength and prowess, especially against the Soviet T-34s, which were tired and outdated.
T-34 could do only 2 shots per minute, and Tiger could do 6-7 shots per minute. And maximum range of T-34 was about 1 kilometer. And for Tiger, it was 3 kilometers. It means while Russian tanks were moving, Germans had more time for targeting, and as a result, one Tiger could destroy several Soviet tanks within the same period of time.
Commanding a Tiger tank platoon is 29-year-old Panzer ace Mikhail Wittmann, a graduate of officer and tank school. After 10 years of service, he's one of the most revered tank commanders in the German army. As Wittmann and the other Tiger commanders rush towards the battlefield, they are faced with 100 enemy tanks speeding over the hills and heading straight for them.
Despite the fact that they are hugely outnumbered by the Soviet tanks, Wittmann and his crew remain incredibly calm. Once the Soviet army were about half a mile away, Wittmann and the other tank commanders of the Tiger tanks gave the order to open fire, and one by one they began to pick off the Soviet tanks, effectively destroying their formation.
The 5th Guards Tank Army, which came at them, was just like lambs to the slaughter. It was a suicidal attack. It was not good tactics, and they took mass casualties.
Around them, there were burning wrecks of the T-34 tanks, the charred bodies of those who'd been killed, the injured and the dying crying out.
So from the soldiers' point of view, it was really a bloody mess.
For the first time during the war, Germans used tanks which superseded technologically, the famous Russian T-34. And those tanks were Tigers.
The Germans may have the cream of the crop of tanks, as well as an elite fighting force. But as the Battle of Prokhorovka rages, Hitler's men realize they are coming up against a major obstacle.
German tank commanders described seeing hundreds of tanks crossing the battlefield. It was clear at Prokhorovka that Stalin had massively outproduced the Germans.
They defeated one unit and another came, and still another came and another came. And this was kind of, wow, how much material and how many tanks do they have, actually?
This was clearly a much stronger army than the one they had encountered earlier in the war.
By 1943, Hitler's Reich controls all major land routes and occupies the majority of European territories, rendering military production by the enemy nigh on impossible. So to the stunned and outnumbered Germans at Prokhorovka, a question remains.
They must have been thinking, how is it possible to rearm to such an extent?
The origins of Stalin's abundance of resources can be traced back to 2 years earlier, and an unexpected alliance.
After weeks of bitter debate, the Lend-Lease bill passes the Senate.
We shall send you in ever-increasing numbers ships, planes, tanks, guns. That is our purpose and our pledge.
Before the United States got involved in the war proper, Roosevelt realized that he would have to somehow support those who were fighting the Nazis. And he came up with a scheme which became nicknamed Lend-Lease. And what that meant was that the Americans would supply products, goods, oil, equipment, ships, tanks, and that the recipient nation wouldn't yet have to pay for them. The Soviet Union desperately needed material and equipment as well, and so the West began to supply them.
But transporting millions of tons worth of equipment to the other side of the world becomes one of the most dangerous operations of the Second World War. Starting in Scotland and Iceland, ships of the British and American navies travel over northern Norway and around the Arctic Circle before reaching the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Archangel. Each trip takes between 10 to 15 days. Along the way, sailors face brutal gales, pack ice, extreme temperatures, and the threat of enemy attack as they travel through Arctic waters off the coast of Nazi-occupied Norway.
There were examples of destroyers sometimes being capsized because of the amount of ice on their decks. It was under constant attack from the Germans, bombers, U-boats, battleships. In the whole of the Second World War, I think you'd probably prefer to be anywhere else than on an Arctic convoy.
By the end of the war, approximately 400 ships have delivered over 4 million tons of supplies to the Red Army. But Stalin's colossal rearmament is also a result of huge changes carried out within Russia itself. In 1941, following Germany's overwhelming success against the Red Army during Operation Barbarossa, Stalin makes a drastic move.
Stalin needs to get his factories as far away from the German front line and German-occupied territory as possible, so he moves them hundreds of miles to the east. He also moves millions of the local populations so that they can work in these factories, producing the materials that they need for a victory.
So production facilities were set up in Siberia, beyond the Urals, and other places too that were beyond the reach of German bombs.
Over the next year, more than 1,500 factories are moved far beyond the clutches of the enemy.
So the combination of this massive output of Soviet production plus Lend-Lease meant that suddenly the Soviet Union went from a place that could barely get enough arms. Now he had a totally different situation, and the Soviet Union was on the way to be one of the industrial powerhouses of the world.
Back on the battlefield of Prokhorovka, despite being massively outnumbered by the Soviets in men and material, the elite German units have done the unthinkable. In 24 hours, they've managed to destroy over 380 enemy tanks, losing just 50 or so of their own. Meanwhile, the battlefield has claimed nearly 4,000 Red Army casualties, compared to just 937 Germans.
If you ask German tankers present at Prokhorovka, how's it going? They say, we're mopping the floor with them. They would say, this is our dream, one Soviet tank going up after the other.
Manstein's men are on the cusp of breaking through to Kursk. But then, on the 13th of July, he is summoned to Hitler's eastern headquarters. Once there, Manstein discovers that the Führer has reached breaking point. It emerges that while Manstein was making gains in the south, the Soviets unleashed an almighty and unexpected counterattack on Modul's already depleted troops in the north, finishing off the northern offensive once and for all. At the same time that over 500,000 Red Army soldiers are launching a colossal counterattack on the Eastern Front, Hitler receives disastrous news from Western Europe.
There's something that happens, halfway across the world, quite literally, and that's the big Allied landing on Sicily.
And all of a sudden he realizes that the fronts are moving in all over the world, and that the victory that he assumed would happen a couple of years before is getting further and further away.
With Hitler's allies in the West facing imminent invasion, and the fight in the East unraveling before his eyes, there's only one choice: to call off the Battle of Kursk.
Manstein wishes to continue the Battle of Kursk. There are still Soviets in front of him at Prokhorovka, and the Germans have been making progress. No one has been more adamant in calling for this offensive. He wanted it early, he's been arguing for it, and now he wants it to continue.
Some of the German high command believed that they had to carry on. One of them talked about holding a wolf by its ears. The most dangerous thing is to let go.
A desperate Manstein manages to convince Hitler to let him continue the fight in the south. But with reinforcements needed in the north of Kursk, as well as in Italy, Manstein will have to fight with diminished resources. 6 weeks later, with their huge numbers of men and equipment, the Soviets managed to reclaim key strongholds and force the Germans to retreat. After 50 days of fighting, the Battle of Kursk is over.
There is nothing the Germans can do from this point on to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. The German army can only slow things down. They may win in certain areas at the tactical level, but it doesn't matter what they bring to the table. The Soviet Union is going to win this war.
The fighting at Kursk saw a clash of armor never witnessed before in World War II. 12,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and over 3.5 million soldiers, a third of whom were either killed or wounded.
The Battle of Kursk was such a vast scale that added together meant that Nazi Germany was really inevitably going to be defeated.
It was the beginning of the end for Adolf Hitler. While Stalingrad blunted Hitler's capacity to carry on fighting in Russia, Kursk really ended it.
Following the defeat, not only does Hitler irrevocably lose his power in the East, he also loses the loyalty of some of his most faithful servants, such as Himmler.
Himmler started to attend meetings. They started to discuss overthrowing Hitler, of there being a military coup, and of reinventing the Nazi Party.
Several attempts would be made on Hitler's life by officials within the Third Reich, forcing an increasingly unstable Hitler to isolate himself even further from his men and the German public.
The fact that Hitler's own men were now prepared to conspire against him shows that the high command of the German army was beginning to realize that the only way that the war could be won was without Hitler.
Meanwhile, in the east, following their victory at Kursk, Stalin and his Red Army continue to push the Germans out of Russia, taking back territories that just a few months earlier the Nazis had occupied.
Soviet morale has definitely reached a turning point where some people were not certain of victory before they became increasingly convinced that the Soviet Union could win the war.
The road to victory runs through Kursk. It's the last big German offensive inside the Soviet Union. Kursk proves once and for all who's the dominant army in the Eastern Front.
So it was really a decisive battle. Suddenly the Russians had shown that they can beat the Germans, and now everything is possible. They can destroy Nazism. They can make it to Berlin even. They can defeat Hitler.